generous funding to complete this project, along with the Schwartzman College of Computing, NSF, and SSRC, and of course, to Stephanie and Erica for such a generous invitation. So I'm really excited to be presenting a project today that's been a year in the making on COVID-related misinformation. And I think the general principles that we've been able to distill here will continue to be relevant moving forward, especially when we're talking about other domains like climate change and the future of democracy. I should also note that the data for a lot of this project was provided by CrowdTangle, which is a platform from Facebook.
There's lunch if you want.
But before I really get started, I want to flag the racial valences of the pandemic that have really led to violence against Asian communities in the US. And I say this very specifically as an Asian American woman doing research on coronavirus misinformation. And I'm really imploring everyone here to be attentive about the active domestic terrorism, both in Atlanta and across the US. So while I think everyone should absolutely donate to Asian American mutual aid organizations if you have the means, there's an excellent free online course on bystander intervention. It's only an hour and it includes concrete examples of what you can do, and I'll put the link in the chat later. But if you take anything away from this talk today, I hope that you'll be able to learn about how to de-escalate violence that has been magnified due to this kind of misinformation around COVID, especially against Asian communities. So to the research, I want to clarify a little bit first about what I mean when I say the project. So one of the most exciting things about working on this is that we've been able to turn this academic research, which will appear at Computer-Human Interaction in May and has won the Honorable Mention Award for Best Paper, into an interactive data storytelling project, which I worked on with another graduate student and 7 UROPs. And as you might have seen on Twitter, I've also created a 30-second trailer for a much longer explainer video, which will come out in the next month or two. And so in other words, we've really tried to give this research the New York Times graphic and Vox Media treatment in hopes of really translating this computational and ethnographic work for a public audience. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So to that end, I'm really going to split the talk into 2 sections. I want to share first our research insights. What did we find? What did we do? And then I'll pull back the curtain a little bit to show you how the sausage was made, so to speak. So how did we do this? Where do we go from here? And as many of us no doubt know, data visualizations like Flatten the Curve have really shaped the public health responses to COVID in really critical ways. And for some, it's about fighting coronavirus with big data or creating interactive data-driven models. And importantly, there seems to be a kind of collective intuition that bigger data, better uses of technology, higher data literacy, greater capacity scale, et cetera, will kind of pave the way for us to move outside of the crisis. And these graphs and this impulse to do data for good has been critical both for experts and for the broader public to make sense of the pandemic. But what does it really mean for something to be data-driven? And what kinds of work can and should data visualizations do? So what we've really tried to do in this project is try to track the social life of information. How do graphs morph as they leave the hands of a journalist at the Financial Times and then show up in your Twitter timeline? So we did this by combining tools in computational social science so that we have a sense for how information circulates at a larger scale. So we're talking about 500,000 tweets and 41,000 visualizations. And we combined that with digital ethnography so that we can identify phenomena in a more granular fashion by tracking the dynamics that persist on Facebook. So here I'm really just investigating 5 Facebook groups over the course of 6 months, day in and day out. So we choose these 2 methods for 2 reasons. First, in order to really get a sense for how prevalent this phenomena are in terms of scale, but also to find ecologically appropriate methods for the data sets that were available to us. So as social media researchers among us know, studying Twitter is exciting because the API gives you so much quantitative data, to the point where Zeynep Tufekci really calls Twitter the model organism of quantitative social media research. On the other hand, Facebook is famously way more tight-fisted about their quantitative data, and then everything that you can get is mediated through their platform called CrowdTangle, which any academic can basically apply for access to. And it's a really fantastic content discovery tool that academic and industry professionals alike can use to track trends about across Facebook ecosystems. So like Facebook groups, pages, Instagram, and there are lots of really interesting ways that you can also use this for your teaching. So let's be a little bit more concrete here. So when it comes to the computational social science, we first collected all the tweets mentioning some combination of the words COVID data that had an image attached to it. So when I say like COVID, I mean infection, mask, coronavirus, virus, these different permutations. And then we created a network of Twitter users, which we classified. And we classified the communities using the Luhmann method. And concurrently, as we're like working with the Twitter users, we also classified all of the images that were associated with each of the tweets using a computer vision model that's been trained by Jorge Poco and Jeff Here, in order to kind of really understand what kinds of data visualizations do these different groups use. So like when it comes to computer vision, basically we're able to kind of segment these different charts and say like, these are the collection of bar charts, these are line charts, these are maps, so on and so forth. So when it comes to the digital ethnography, we first started by collecting posts where people talk about COVID-related data. And then we started to develop and start collecting posts about where people are doing their own COVID-related data analysis. And we ultimately ended up collecting a lot of angry Facebook posts where people who hate masks talk about science and talk about data. And there's really this iterative process between these different kinds of posts that we end up collecting throughout the course of the digital ethnography. And so the question that we end up asking is, what does following the data or using science really mean for anti-mask communities? I would say at the outset, like we weren't necessarily looking at anti-mask communities. There was a kind of more general research question we were interested in, which is like, what happens to data visualizations that are happening on social media? Like, are people interested in it? And it wasn't really until we kind of went deep into the digital ethnography that we realized there's this whole group of people who are using data in nefarious ways. But methodologically, when I say digital ethnography, I'm talking about this entire process where we're like collecting posts that seem to be working in different arenas and using what Sharmaz calls grounded theory, or this iterative process of data collection, coding, and analysis, such that the research questions and our hypotheses change as we collect new data. At the same time, we're really trying to develop what I call deep lurking, which is bouncing off of Clifford Geertz's famed anthropologist essay on deep hanging out, where he kind of talks about how the most significant anthropological insights really come in informal settings. So it's not just about structured interviews, but about understanding the kind of ecosystem and of ideas that each of these people are really embedded in within these Facebook groups. So let's look a little bit at the network, because there are two things that really come out of this research on the computational side. So if you really zoom in, we have like a couple of discrete communities that I'll talk about. I will say at the outset too, that each of these communities are somewhat porous. So for example, in what we kind of call the American politics and right-wing media community, which in itself is a very complicated, conflicted status, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. The most number of followers is Barack Obama. Barack Obama is clearly not part of the right-wing media or the right-wing establishment. But what we're really interested in with these linkages is who gets mentioned, who gets retweeted, and who gets commented on. So what are the interactions between people on a social media? And here, I mean, we're really talking about like the whole gamut of media organizations like CNN, Washington Post, et cetera. And inevitably, when they cover coronavirus in the US, they will inevitably tag the former president. And so we're able to kind of map out these linkages. And what I find really compelling about each of these communities is that we were also able to compute what we think is a proxy of insularity. So what percentage of tweets kind of stay within the community? Are you retweeting someone else who's in the community or commenting, or are you really reaching outside your normal scope in order to have these conversations on Twitter? Another community we found really interesting was one centered around Joe Biden, which we've called the mainstream politics and left-wing media, where you have both a mix of images like this, where people are talking about decision-making that's happening at really high levels, and graphs showing the extent of the carnage that the pandemic has wrought. We also see like other interesting communities that aren't necessarily situated across a number of people, but become situated around a specific graph. So for example, here you have this like New York Times centric community, but it's really actually centered around this specific graph that becomes so significant that it ends up taking up its own like outsized amount of space, where you really have the New York Times breaking this specific case about the way that coronavirus affects different people across the US. Of course, the most famous example that I think people have been able to see on social media is really the incredible amount of data visualizations coming out of Financial Times in the UK that really kind of track not just the rate that coronavirus has really taken throughout different countries, but also specific to particular policies like that of Nicola Sturgeon. But the group that ultimately we were most interested in are what we call the anti-mask groups. So we use this term very intentionally in the sense that it is a word that many of these groups ascribe to themselves. So they would call us maskers or sheep. They would use those terms like pretty interchangeably. So they're anti-mask by juxtaposition. So I'm really using an emic term here. But I mean, what we find really fascinating about these anti-mask groups is, one, they're using data in incredibly sophisticated ways to kind of show how the death rate is on decline, even in June of 2020. And they're really mobilizing it in really powerful ways to show how, like science can somehow be harnessed for fear and for social control. And they're really trying to push against this. And I mean, I think one of the most surprising findings for me, frankly, is that the person with the most followers is quantifiably Elon Musk, and 80% of the people who are within these groups are only talking to each other. So let us zoom in on this specific group and like analyze a couple of the visualizations that come out of it. So I'll go through a couple of examples and then talk through like larger implications. So first, what I find really interesting is that there are actually an outsized number of tables where there's raw data kind of splayed out in the body of the tweet. So what I find interesting about this is that the fixation tables is in part due to a fixation on immediacy. So where visualizations can kind of obscure by using, fancy interactive components or like different ways of like representing intensity, tables are like the one sure way where people can access the data without any form of mediation. And so like in some ways, I think this is really emblematic of the ways that they've been able to kind of powerfully assert like the reasons why schools should be reopening or to completely end mask mandates, is by showing how immediate a lot of these ramifications can be for the course of the pandemic. This is perhaps one of the most shared charts that I've seen that is really, really compelling. So I think one other thing that I want to note about a lot of these charts is that there's a high, they're often heavily annotated, where there's always a source at the very bottom, so that you know that it looks the part when it comes to leveraging this kind of scientific evidence. So here you see this person talking about how the death rate is very steadily in decline. And I think there's a kind of appeal to the data as a way to really underscore how much they think that the US government is really there's an appeal to using data and science in order to show how the response is completely overblown. And of course, there are also comparisons that often try to minimize the extent to which the pandemic has really ravaged a bunch of communities. So it's not just about sharing charts, but it's also about really cultivating a discourse and a community of practice around these charts that people are sharing in order to make the case as powerfully as possible. So moving from the network graph, we also ended up creating a classification of the visualizations, as I kind of mentioned earlier, with the computer vision model. And ultimately what we ended up finding is we're able to classify all of these different visualizations into discrete buckets. So you have images, choropleth or heat maps, dashboards, bar charts, area charts, etc. And I think what I find interesting about this scatter plot is that you can really start to quantify per each community what kinds of visualizations are most prevalent. So when you see this chart, for example, we're able to replicate that same scatter plot across these different communities. So for example, like in group one, the community centered around right-wing politics and right-wing media, you have like a kind of general distribution of all of these different types of graphs. And I think when I came into a lot of this data at the outset, I think our main hypotheses were that, the anti-mask group simply would be using things like 3D bar charts or not be adhering to best practices whatsoever. Whereas I think as we've been able to quantify here, they're actually using the same number of visualizations in with more intensity. So what I mean by that is, I think in each of these specific groups, you have a single visualization that might be the most impactful. So I don't know if I can see, okay, I can't use a pointer. But so for example, in group two, you see that like large purple circle. And then in group three, at the top right corner, you have that like large gray circle. Each of these visualizations are basically like one-hit wonders. It's a single visualization shared multiple different times, which is why the circle becomes larger and larger. It's how we are quantifying engagement. And what's compelling about this is that even if each group has a single one, the anti-mask group, group 4, which is at the bottom left-hand side, they're kind of evenly distributed. It's not as if they're primarily sharing screenshots or sharing caricatures or sharing 3D bar charts. They're really sharing line charts and area charts that might not otherwise be out of place in a scientific journal or in the New York Times. And what we've been able to create actually alongside all of these, UROPS is an interactive dashboard where you can really be identifying each of these different visualizations and filtering by community. So that is an Indian political community, which is much smaller, but then you can also filter by specific types of visualizations. So feel free to explore all of these different communities. You can also zoom in and out so you can see the specific users. And when you click on a visualization, the tweet will pop up. So as far as actually looking at the content of what people were saying in these Facebook groups, we ended up doing a discourse analysis, which we've kind of simplified for this visualization that we've put online. To really get a sense of what people are talking about. At the outset, we kind of quantify like the different types of conversations people were having. Like they're talking about the fact that closing schools doesn't work, or that the data so far doesn't justify the current response of like using mask mandates. Some of the data is unreliable or rigged, or like we need better visualizations in order to make good decisions. And I think that's the one thing that's kind of consistent across all of this data for me is that when I'm thinking about how to do critical data science, a lot of that relies on being critical about the sources, understanding the ways that data sets are constructed, understanding how visualization and like the creation of data sets itself is political. I think these are all arguments that humanists working with data are really familiar with. And it really like galled me, frankly, in order to see this kind of logic, which I think is grounded in really good humanistic inquiry and STS, be perverted in these anti-mask groups where they too are critical of the sources where a lot of this data comes from. It just so happens that the source is the CDC. They are attuned to the ways that data and science are political by pointing to examples like how the tobacco industry has historically distorted science. And they bring up examples like this to show why we can't be trusting Moderna or Pfizer, because big pharma too is out for our money. So, there's these convergences between what counts as scientific expertise and what counts as something, as an entity that one can trust, that I think is really, really horrifying and exciting, frankly, about this kind of discourse. So when we're looking at all of the different kinds of visualizations within these anti-mask communities, certainly we thought that there would be lots of COVID fatality charts that looked very much like the one at the top center, where you have COVID fatalities described by having like the governor's heads caricatured. But I mean, I think the kind of practices that we really see surfacing throughout these groups are ideas like original content. So like there's a fixation for these groups on trying to find the data set that is like not mediated whatsoever by any news source. So they're looking directly at like Department of Health statistics, where they're running live streams for each other in order to kind of determine which kinds of data you can download from which portals in order to find the most powerful information. They also identify problems with data sources and representations. They talk about how like certain governors have an interest in like showing like the highest number of deaths possible. They talk about how hospitals are incentivized to inflate their COVID death rates in order to get more money from the state. I mean, I think even if I disagree vehemently with all of the different things that they've talked about, I think the fact that they're able to make this critical move to talk about like critical sources or critical representations, I think is something that's really worth grappling with, because it's not just about more critical thinking or more data literacy in order to fix these problems. They also talk about identifying bias or politics in the data in a very similar way. And they talk about how science is a tool for bolstering social unity and is a tool for really understanding how expertise should be used for public governance. And ultimately, they're also really concerned about platform censorship. So a lot of the groups that we ended up studying no longer exist. They have either been deleted by Facebook, especially when they were really cracking down on COVID vaccine misinformation, or they had sufficient number of posts which were removed that they've moved to new platforms completely. And I'm happy to talk more about that as well. Ultimately, they also really try to use this data to mobilize for political action. So I can point to a couple of instances where in Texas and Ohio, where these groups have really brought together the data to support lawsuits against the government to try to lift mask mandates. So how do these people really go wrong? I mean, I can come up with three major reasons. First, there's a fixation on deaths versus cases. So for them, like case numbers don't mean anything because they can be very easily doctored, whereas deaths are more binary, like either a person is dead or not. And so like by only fixating on one statistic and not the other, they're able to basically erase like an entire swath of information about the way that coronavirus is really unfolded. I think there's a second point about lived experience. So I think in a lot of the groups that I studied, which usually are not in major metropolitan areas, it depends, but they're usually not in places that have really, really high incidence of COVID. And so they see a fundamental disconnect between the communities in which they live and the statistics that they get, for example, on the state or the national level. And so there's an impulse to try to bridge this gap, but because many of these local health departments simply don't have the resources to maybe set up their own coronavirus data dashboards, they're able to infer data based on like their own sleuthing, or they try to look for state level data that honestly, for many of these cases, just doesn't exist. So there's this mismatch between what they experience and what they see in the data, which is a reason to discount it. But ultimately, I think for a lot of these anti-maskers, science is ultimately a process and not an institution. So they reject the institution of like mainstream science or the CDC, the scientific establishment, and instead for them, science is something that one should be able to experience for yourself. So I think one thing that has really stuck with me is the invocation of both Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper in some of these conversations where in one group, they were really talking about how they were collecting and analyzing data in a way that would pave the path for a new paradigm where like for them, doing science is a personal process where like it needs to be kind of subjected to constant scrutiny in order for it to be real. And so for them, that science is really part of like a separate worldview that will ultimately overtake past paradigms because they'll have punched enough holes in the other kind of scientific research. And the other invocation that I've really been shocked by is they also invoke Karl Popper to show how like science needs to be subjected to constant falsification in order for it to be true. And I think in all, like these ways that these anti-mask groups have really been able to show how science is a political process and one that they can use to their advantage in order to overturn things like public health measures is something that I think I continue to grapple with today and really excited to hear more about how other people like think about this and especially when it comes to thinking about moving forward after the pandemic. I also definitely want to thank all of my collaborators with whom this entire project would not have been possible. In order to work on this, I relied very heavily on my two advisors, one in anthropology, Graham Jones, who's here today, and Arvind Satyanarayan, my advisor in computer science. Alongside my hardy collaborators, Jonathan, who helped, another graduate student in ECS, who helps me really direct these large group of wonderful undergraduate research assistants to create the interactive narrative that you'll be able to see later, and for this group to do this research with me at all. Anyways, I'm really excited to hear what people have to say, and we'll turn it over to Q&A.